Because it is. It's a terrible dark room, and it's just a terrible situation to be in early in the morning. Good. Then we'll start out with the video of the day.
Alex, what matter?
Whoa!
That's right. How many?
2.
That's right. You're a good
Can I
boy.
go back?
No,
Can I go
sweetie.
back?
No, you can't go back yet. You got.
You want some water?
All right. Do you want some water, or are you just asking to interrupt? You're just asking to interrupt. I know you.
Go back?
I know you. Hey. Look. What color bigger? What color bigger?
Green.
Green. Oh, you're a good boy. Okay, Alex, look. Well, look what I got for you. Hey, look. Look at all these neat toys. Look. Hey, look, can you tell me, on the tray, how many green block? Green block.
2.
Good parrot. 2 green block. 2. Good parrot. One of the things Alex doesn't have is a knee-jerk response to the types of objects that you present him. He can look at 2 objects and answer several different types of questions about those objects, or he can look at a novel collection of items and answer questions about that collection. What this shows us is that he really understands what those questions mean.
The whole thing.
Yes, Alex.
You're
That's
right.
right,
Good
teacher.
boy.
Alex describing objects. Alex saying, probably want more than a cracker.
Is what you want?
Okay. So you can always go back and watch the rest of that at home. There's a lot more on this particular parrot, in case you didn't know him yet, on the internet. There's also generally a lot more out there on language acquisition in non-human animals. Does anybody have an idea of why I might have shown this particular video at the beginning of a lecture where we'll also be talking in part about what Descartes thought about, intelligent machines or artificial intelligence? So Irene, yeah. So sentient awareness, that, not clear whether Descartes would have allowed that. So that would have might have been something that went off Descartes' list. But the second thing that you said is the thing that both Descartes and many people today would still continue to doubt, right? Real reasoning abilities, real understanding, real concept possession. That is something only human animals have in the traditional picture. That's a sharp dividing line. And the astonishing thing about this is, if we believe Irene Pepperberg, this bird, walnut-sized brain, has understanding, right? He grasps the meaning, or grasped the meaning of concepts. And she argues that he was able to do this because he's able to respond to different questions about the same collections of objects, right? How many green objects? How many triangles on the tray, right? Those are different questions, and he was able to answer them flexibly. So that poses a certain challenge to that claim, right? That claim that reason, intellect, understanding is the thing that sets us apart from all machines and from all other types of animals. And we'll come back to that later. So kind of keep that in mind. Of course, you can criticize this in various ways, but that's kind of a challenge that we have there in the background. So brief recap as to what we did on Monday. We had looked in some detail at this very famous argument and talked about why it is a bit of a strange argument, so the cogito. And we had said that it's the type of argument where the conclusion seems to follow directly from a single premise, namely the premise being a proposition, I am, I exist, that is entertained in a certain way, right? Anytime you think this proposition, anytime you think anything whatsoever, where thinking is understood in a wide sense of having any conscious experiences, any thoughts, wonderings, doubts whatsoever, you are thereby also immediately assured that you exist as a thinking thing. That's what Descartes wants to say. if this is true, if this works, then the cogito also only works in the first person present tense. It is me who is thinking right now. I am becoming aware of a thought or an experience occurring, and therefore I also exist as the bearer, as the possessor of these experiences, as a subject of experience. So that's the immediate piece of self-assurance that Descartes gets in being conscious and having any thoughts whatsoever. That's that basic type of self-knowledge that comes along with every conscious experience, and that he's then also going to use as the basis for all further claims. So that's going to be the foundation upon which he will construct all further beliefs, and that is supposed to serve as the foundation of all further kinds of knowledge. So that's where we had stopped last time. We had also considered that that results in a quite different definition of mind and matter. So I'm not going to run you through this list again, but you will remember that in Descartes' conception, he had said, I can understand, just as a conceptual point, I can define minds and bodies independently of each other. Minds have no spatial properties, but they are conscious, they involve thinking, they involve self-knowledge of thinking. We have direct access to what is going on in our own minds, whereas bodies, matter is necessarily extended, has spatial properties, has parts, is destructible, is also intersubjectively knowable. And we had ended here, and we had said that this is a point about how to define minds and bodies. So all of this can be done purely in the armchair, right? All of this is purely a priori about how we can grasp what it is to have a mind and a body. But something more is needed as to why minds and bodies are really supposed to be distinct, and that's where we pick up today. So that's where we're going to continue. This is that crucial second step, and Descartes is going to take it in Meditation 6. So the rough overview of what we're going to do today is this. I'm going to give you a little more context on background historical thinking. What did his contemporaries think about what he was up to? So you'll get a little more insight into 17th and 18th century philosophy as we go through this as well. We'll be talking about how he tries to establish that mind and body are really distinct, but also how he tries to put them back together and argue for the interaction between mind and body. We'll talk about some problems that this way of thinking about this raises under point 2 and 3. And then at the end, we'll come back to the question of how we get knowledge about other minds and other kinds of minds, and that will tie in a little bit to Alex the Gray Parrot in the video that you just saw at the beginning. So first of all, how does Descartes establish the real distinction? And now there are many different ways of reconstructing this argument, but this is the way he does it in the piece that you've been reading, and it's a bit of a tricky one, and it's easy to misunderstand. So again, I've just pulled the whole quotation onto a slide to walk you through it. And the crucial thing that you can see here is paragraph 2, right? Or what he says down there at the bottom. He says, I have a distinct and clear idea, read a distinct and clear concept. I can exactly define what it is to have a self, what it is to be a mind, and I can distinctly define what it is to have body. That's what we just did. Those are the two long lists. And I can see that nothing on the one list requires anything on the other list. They exclude each other. I can define them independently without contradiction. I can conceive of mind without thereby also conceiving of body. But then he thinks something more is needed. So how does he move from conceivability to a claim that there's an actual distinction, an actual difference between these things? And the thing that he has in the background is what he tells us at the beginning of the quotation, right? He is also, and this is something that he has done earlier in the Meditations, in Meditations 3 and 5, which you didn't read and which you don't have to worry about. There's a big technical discussion where he's saying, can I really trust my ability to clearly and distinctly understand things? And why can I do so? And his argument is going to be that he can do so because God exists, because he isn't an evil demon, because God would not deceive him, and because God has arranged things such that he can trust his clear and distinct ideas. Not just any ideas he has, right? Descartes still allows that he can be deceived about things, but certain ideas, certain concepts, certain forms of understanding are going to be guaranteed to be a guide to truth, to real knowledge. And those are clear and distinct ideas because God is in the background guaranteeing that they will be true. Now, there's a huge problem with this, right? There's a huge problem, and that's the central problem for Descartes in some ways, in saying, do you really want to let every further piece of knowledge rest upon the assumption of a God who is not a deceiver, a particular type of Christian God? That's a real problem for him. However, if this is really bothering you, we'll get to some ways later on how this is still a very nicely modern idea in some ways. And there are kind of neutral ways of spelling out this argument as well. So many people, and we'll see this later in later weeks, especially when we come to talk about Searle, there are many versions of conceivability arguments that will move from conceivability to actual claims about how the world is just based on conceptual considerations. So you don't necessarily need to put God into that picture. That's just the way Descartes does it. So don't get too hung up about that aspect, but that's just the way he is justifying this claim. But this gets us something quite interesting, and this comes back to why Descartes is at least a little bit subversive at that time, right? Because if he can now trust, he thinks he now has a good reason to trust his own intellect, his own capacity for understanding things, his own ability to have ideas about the world. He now has an argument in the background for trusting his reasoning skills. And this is kind of the other core tenet of Cartesian philosophy, aside from the foundationalism that I was talking about. So building up all knowledge from some secure foundations, Descartes is also going to say that the way you do this is not through sensory perception, is not through experience. All of that can lead us astray, but is through your rational capacities, because you are at core, and that comes back to the cogito, a mind and an intellect that can understand things. So this is the core claim, and again, if you're making that claim, then the very attractive idea is that you can build up all kinds of knowledge just by using your mind, by using your critical thinking capacities, basically. Yeah? You don't need anything else, you don't need an authority, you don't need anyone else to tell you what to think. And basically, your own judgment and intellect is always going to be the test of what you accept as true. So that's the assumption that is working here in the background. And he's even going to say that that is the way that we come to know about bodies in the external world. So he's even going to say, strictly speaking, seeing is not knowing, right? My senses can always deceive me. He's told us this in the beginning, and he continues to say there are always cases where sensory perception or imagination can be misleading. So again, I'm going to have to use my intellect, my mind, to decide whether two objects that appear the same are really the same, whether I'm really correctly seeing the size of an object, for instance. So even in knowledge about the external world, it's always going to be the intellect that comes in. So that's what really sets him apart from empiricism. And now he has a method for trusting his rational capacities, but he also has a method for constructing knowledge about the external world on that basis and building it up from there. So he now knows that minds and bodies are distinct. He knows that he exists. He knows that God exists. And he knows that he can trust his clear and distinct ideas. And from there, he can use this, and this is the other thing that he's after aside from dualism, he can use this to build a completely new kind of physics. And again, this is not something that you really, so I'm just trying to give you kind of a taste of what he was after and kind of to make it maybe a bit more compelling and say, look, these are some of the reasons why this really was a game changer, this book. Here he's telling us two things. So first of all, at his time, Aristotelian physics had all kinds of subjective qualities woven into it, colors and that type of thing, sounds, sensory qualities, really, that were all kind of woven into the way that the schools, that scholars conceived of matter. And Descartes is saying we have to get rid of all of this subjective stuff, really. That doesn't belong into our conception of the physical world. Everything that we need to understand material objects are perfectly quantifiable, measurable, intersubjectively accessible qualities such as shape, size, proportion, all of the stuff that was on the matter side of the list. That's measurable. You can put numbers on it, and everybody can easily agree on it. And that's all we need in physics. We can build a complete physics on the basis of those types of properties. So really, he's working, and he's also going to say we can use basically mechanical rules to explain everything there is to know about bodies. And this will include living bodies, and this will also include animals. So those are just complicated mechanics going on. That's what he's saying. So he's really, in one way, taking kind of subjective properties and pushing them back and narrowing them down to the area of the conscious mind. So he's still allowing them somewhere, but he's really narrowing the import that they have. And then he says this other thing, and this is actually a very nice and quite modern idea as well. And he says, well, what do we do about the sensory properties then? So colors, sounds, and smells, the way we actually do perceive bodies through perception in all of those different ways. Texture, for instance. All of that stuff, that's not something you can put a number on. And here he's going to say, well, on the one hand, I'm going to assume that these properties do correspond to some other objective properties, to some physical properties that are, again, measurable in terms of size, shape, and so on. But I'm not going to assume that anything in the world out there actually resembles colors and sounds and tastes, right? So I'm going to take them out of physics. I'm going to assume that I can use that they stand in for something else. But these are really just ways that I perceive objects. Objects aren't there, really aren't colored. I don't have direct access to them. They aren't the way they seem. All I have access to is mental representations of things out there. And the relation is not one of resemblance. So that's a difficult idea to kind of grasp. But in one way, it's also a very modern idea, right? Because many people today would say, well, that's exactly the way things are. We don't directly perceive objects out there, right? The story is going to be a different one than in Descartes, but one of the stories is going to be, well, today we might say we have complex brain processing, activity in the visual cortex that produces a visual impression of something, but isn't putting us in direct contact with the world. And here you have this very basic idea of representation in the background. So far, somewhat clear what he's up to here? Yeah? Somewhat? Okay, so then we can move on to the next point. And here the prize question is going to be, how does he put mind and body back together? Now that he's kind of put them apart, dualism is established, physics is completely independent of everything that we can say about minds and mental properties, how does he put them back together? And in Meditation 6, that is what he's trying to do. And here you have this very famous quotation, this very famous analogy that compares the relationship that a mind has to the body, that I have to my body, to the relationship between a sailor and his ship, and hits on an important difference in that relationship. So Descartes really wants to say two things here, and it's important to know both of these things. Also in view of future assessment tasks and so on and so forth. So mind and body are distinct, but that doesn't mean that they don't form a unit. They still form a unit. They're still intermingled in some sense. There's still a very intimate connection between the two, and it is much more intimate than we would have between a sailor and his ship. Why is that? Does anybody know from the readings why he is going to say that, or what the crucial difference is in the sailor analogy? What makes the mind-body connection closer than the ship? Yeah? Pardon? Say that again?
It impacts our emotions more directly than if like the ship is damaged or whatever.
So damage to the ship is not experienced as pain, or not, or if it is in a metaphorical sense, right? I might see that it's damaged, that it's scratched, and that might hurt me in some metaphorical sense, but not in the direct sense that I'm going to directly feel damage to my body, to a hand, to a body part. If I'm pricked, I'm going to immediately react to that. And you said emotions, so that's something that Descartes doesn't do in the Meditations, but he has a whole other book on this, The Passions of the Soul, where he's going to say emotions, the passions, are actually our way of sensing the body, of sensing bodily changes in some sense. And that is a very modern idea. And so that's exactly the point. I can feel pain in a way that I don't feel damage or bodily damage in a way that I don't feel damage to the ship. And this is closely related to some other problem. And this is a famous problem. Here we have Dave Chalmers, probably one of the most famous current philosophers of mind, Australian philosopher. If you've heard of him, you can watch the YouTube video on how he explains this. And this is what is often called the hard problem of consciousness. So if that's true, that kind of raises the problem. If I have this unique way of sensing changes in the body as pain, as hunger, as ticklish sensations, as joy, why do they have to feel exactly the way they do? Right? That seems to be kind of a mystery. It seems to be a mystery why, not just why do pains feel this specific way and not why are they different in this exact way from tickles? Why do bluish sensations have exactly that? And you don't know what further to say about that quality, exactly that experiential quality that is really distinctive but also kind of ineffable in some sense. How does that happen, and how do we get that? For Descartes, not from neurons, but in the current formulation, how could we ever predict from facts about the brain or from facts about the body why this particular subjective quality emerges? And a lot of people think that this is the core challenge for neuroscience and philosophy, right? Because it seems just impossible to explain why things had to be that way or why anything had to feel like anything at all in the first place. So that's a real mystery. And we find the origin of this problem right there in the Meditations as well. So that's one early formulation of it, where he says, well, why should that sensation give rise to this particular distress? Why couldn't hunger have felt differently? Why did it have to be like that and different from thirst? And Descartes is going to say, well, we're going to assume that that's the way pains feel and hungers feel is just the way that is most conducive to our well-being, right? That's just the way that is best for us and works best for us. And there is something a bit weird about this answer. So you might think, well, that sounds a little bit like a Just So story, right? Pains just had to feel like that because they make me react in a certain way. But we can still imagine that things could have been otherwise. And if you feel the pull of that, then you've grasped the argument, yeah? And that kind of, you'll get the same problem if you try to run an evolutionary story here. It always seems that you can ask that further question. Why do colors have to look this way rather than that? Why couldn't blue have looked like red? Could that be switched for somebody else, right? So those are going to be exactly those types of intuitions. Clear so far? So if anybody had a solution to this problem, that would be major progress in the philosophy of mind. Still an open question. So then how do we put the mind back into the body? And this is Descartes' core problem. So there's some way of sensing the body that is very direct, somehow mysterious why things feel exactly the way they do, but that seems to be a special connection that we have to one and only one physical object in the world, namely our body. We sense no other object in that way. But he also can't really allow that the mind spreads out throughout all parts of the body, that it's really intermingled with all parts of the body. That's really weird because minds aren't spatial. So you don't want them kind of spreading out through a spatial entity. That can't work for conceptual reasons. But there are also other reasons that he tells us. And that is kind of from this image where he says, well, we know actually from examples that if you cause damage to the foot down there, it is felt in a certain way. But we can also intervene higher up, right, at different points and cause the same pain, right, higher up kind of in this line that goes up there. And the example that he uses, does anybody have the example that he uses just right off the bat? Of why pain isn't always isn't always caused in the foot, but maybe higher up. Yeah. Go for it. Try it.
Do you mean when, I don't know if I understood the question, but when he talks about the fact that people have phantom pain, they feel like they've got pain?
Yeah, exactly. So phantom limbs, phantom pains. There are sometimes people who lose a limb, but they continue to experience the realistic sensation that the limb is still present. And this shows us, Descartes thinks, that you don't need the actual physical limb being affected to get that same result. You could have the result, the cause coming in somewhere higher up in the chain, right? Maybe even in the brain. You could have the appropriate parts of the brain being affected. He thinks moved mechanically. Today we would say that differently. But that will cause the same kind of pain. So this is kind of cool because he does give us a first or an early example of a phantom limb experience here. And he's pretty much on the right track, right? So this is Ramachandran's mirror box. Do people know this one? People seen this? So there's a real problem for phantom limb patients because they often, after amputation, if amputation is traumatic, they don't just have that phantom limb, but it actually hurts. And many of them are going to say that it's frozen in a particular position that's very painful and uncomfortable. So they're suffering from a phantom limb, but there's no good way to really treat that because it's a phantom limb, right? So in this experiment in the mirror box, and a similar setup is now being used, I think even for arthritis and for a number of other illnesses. But here you ask the phantom limb patient to put the healthy arm and the phantom arm into a box. And they're going to see just the one side from the mirror. And then the patient is going to make movements with the right hand, if they still say they still have their right hand. And what they're going to see through the mirror is the left hand moving. They're going to get a visual image as if their phantom was moving. And they're also asked to imagine that their phantom limb is moving at the same time. And if patients do this, they often say, wow, I can actually now feel through the visual feedback my phantom that is normally paralyzed moving for the first time. So that's kind of cool because that's kind of a way of directly trying to change input, the sensation of a phantom limb. And what is happening here, so this is just a picture of the body map in the brain, right? Representation of body parts in the sensory cortex. And you can see that the body parts are arranged differently and some parts are bigger than others. Like the face is very large, hands are very large, torso and legs are smaller. And you can think about how that maps onto experience, right? But this is a picture that roughly could fit in a Cartesian view, right? You might be causing pain up there in the brain map. And that's what happens. You don't need a limb. All clear? There is going to be a difference, and we're coming to that. And that's, of course, going to be that Descartes is not going to say, well, obviously, right, the mind is spread out throughout the sensory motor cortex or anything like that. That's not something he can say. So he's going to have to say the point of contact where an immaterial mind meets a material body part is going to have to be one small part of the brain. And this is something he does in a different work. This is something he does in the passions that we talked about earlier. And he is going to say that it's this one place in the brain that is basically in the middle of the brain, and there's just one. So it's not, you don't have it in both hemispheres. It's kind of central unified area. It's anatomically, forget the pineal gland idea. It makes no, right, that's just not where consciousness happens at all for a number of reasons, but that's what Descartes thinks. And he thinks it's so because this is going to be the one point where, for example, images from the different eyes are brought together, are fused into one central image and then presented to the mind. So everything is mechanical, the body is mechanical, non-voluntary actions are mechanical, including the entire brain. And then there's this one point where the soul gets to touch the physical world, and that's where the interaction happens in both directions. What is the immediate problem if you look at that picture? Well, this is Dan Dennett's famous critique of this, the Cartesian theater. It's as if everything were happening on a stage, a little stage for the mind, and everything that's experienced is on this stage. And then there's someone sitting there watching. The mind is watching the mental stage. What is a problem with this picture? Yeah.
If something on the self is watching the thing, how do you feel?
Pardon?
If you're only seeing things and you see yourself, how do you experience like yourself? Like, how do you feel things?
No. So first of all, the visual metaphor is much too narrow, right? You don't want it to be just like a conventional cinema experience. You would need something much, much richer than a theater, right? You would need some fully immersive motion capture, interactive VR experience, something much flashier. But even then, there would still be a problem. You're completely right. That is one problem. This won't work. But even if we do that, there's still a problem. Little self in the head, the homunculus. What type of problem does that immediately raise? How do you get consciousness? I mean, there is one problem is going to be there is no little person in the head, right? That's not a good description of what is going on there, obviously. But how do you get consciousness into that little person, into the little homunculus, into the mini self, the mini me that's watching the mental stage? How does that happen? If you're going for that type of account, you're going to have to say, well, they have another little mental stage where things are happening. Well, how does that work? Well, then they have another mini-me in the head, and so on and so forth, right? So you're off to an endless regress. You're off to an endless chain of little selves in even smaller heads at each step. You see how that happens? That's just going to be endless, and that's not something you want in your theory of mind, right? You're just going to have an infinite regress of selves. So that's why you do not want a homunculus. You've just pushed the explanation back one step. And now Dennett isn't interested in the Cartesian theater because he wants to bash Descartes, but because this is actually a very compelling picture that a lot of people still subscribe to, and not just in philosophy, but also in cognitive neuroscience. And there are kind of very attractive ideas here that kind of theater metaphor subscribes to, but that Dennett says won't work. Thinking that there's a place and a single time where conscious presentation occurs, or that consciousness is a presentation for anyone, right? That there is something like visual imagery or a mind's eye or something like that. That there is a central processor versus just radically distributed processing all over the brain. And as soon as you think there's a place where it all comes together, then you might be off to this kind of a problem. So you can see the core of the problem in the Cartesian picture, but kind of a lot of current theories inherit something from it. So it's kind of a nifty way of carving up persistent problems that still have a strong intuitive pull. Clear? Yeah? This is a lot of stuff, but I just want to give you kind of points of contact to newer theories as well and show you some of the things that kind of seem to follow from this way of thinking. Okay? We have 2 more points to cover. Mental causation. How does the contact happen? So say we don't have the theater problem. Say we don't have that issue. We have the point of contact happening in one area. And there's still an issue, and this we get in the first famous formulation from Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, who corresponded with Descartes, and he was very influenced by her. Asking, well, how am I supposed to imagine an interaction between a non-physical thing and a mechanical process, even in a small area in the brain? How is that supposed to happen? All kinds of causation require physical contact and extension. I have no model for conceiving of how causal interaction is going to happen if I don't have anything being pushed or pulled or surface properties being changed, right? It's like good old-fashioned billiard balls, right? One hits the other and they're off in a certain direction, but that's the kind of property that the mind doesn't have. So how does it ever get to influence anything? It's completely baffling, Elizabeth says, right? The only way that we can think of causal interaction is through that type of physical property, and we don't have it here. And Descartes doesn't really answer. He just says, we have a basic notion of this interaction happening. He does try to give a different story, but it's not going to be a great one. So this is one of his central problems. So what would you do? If you take a minute to think about that, we now have an issue. Say you've accepted, or say we have two claims that we can revisit now, right? We have a claim that mind-body interaction occurs. This seems to be an attractive thing. We want to say that minds can influence bodies. We decide to do something and then we do it. As you said, body is hurt and we experience pain. Goes in both directions. Do we want to give that up? And how would we give that up if we gave it up? Or do you want to give up saying that minds are non-material? Take a minute and think about it. If you want, discuss it with your nearest neighbor, and then we'll come back. What would you do? And then I'll give you some idea of what people would have done. So any solutions so far? If who's willing to keep dualism but give up interaction, and how would you go for it? Anyone? This is confusing stuff, right? This is extremely confusing, and that is the way it's just going to stay for a very long time. But that's kind of the cool thing about these old theories, that they kind of help just finding a way into the problems. And if you're seeing the problem, that's really all I want at this point, creating a sense of the problem space. So if you gave up interaction but kept dualism, what kind of picture might that result in? If you think about it metaphorically and spatially, how would you possibly be able to describe that? You had minds in one area, bodies in another. They're not really touching each other. But it seems that they are. I seem to be making decisions and the body is moving, but there's no real interaction happening. Does anybody know the term for this kind of picture? Or how you might explain that? So this is something, I'm not going to read these out. Here are two ways of thinking about this. So this was the prize question of the time, right, coming out of Descartes. And here are two ways of going for this. One is going to be minds are here in this domain, bodies are here in this domain. And it seems that when I make a decision, that is impacting a bodily movement, but really there is no causal interaction taking place. So how is this seeming guaranteed? Well, it happens because there's a third thing in the background causing movements in both, right? Causing pains, experienced pain to be happening in sync with bodily damage, causing decisions to be happening in sync with bodily movements. There's a third independent cause, and Malebranche thought it was God. So the occasion of every bodily movement is going to be something else. That's a very busy, that is asking a lot of God, right? Every single time everyone does something. But you can kind of see the desperation of the problem here, right? Trying to say this is the only way I can grasp this happening, right? So that was a suggested alternative to this. Another one was Leibniz. Maybe they just happen in parallel. And this is kind of a beautiful idea in some way. And there are modern formulations of this. Maybe the mind and the body just kind of reflect each other like mirrors, right? Maybe they just happen in parallel. Maybe there's something like a pre-established harmony between them. They never touch each other, but they exist on parallel planes. And that creates the illusion of an interaction between these two areas. But in this picture, the mind isn't actually doing anything. It's an epiphenomenon, right? It's not really, it's like a little fish in a fishbowl going around and perfectly mirroring movements outside of the bowl but not really affecting anything. So that's one way of going for that, just to kind of keep that picture. It's kind of a beautiful picture, but it's also saying something radical because it's saying minds don't actually do anything in the world. So that's the one option. The other option is what you were saying up here, and that's to say, well, let's give up the claim that minds are immaterial things. Is that what you were thinking? Because you're kind of nodding? Or give up that minds are immaterial beings. And here we have one, mind, man and machine, 18th century. La Maîtrise saying, well, men are just complex, humans are just complex machines. And that's all they are, and there's no special mind stuff coming in on top. It's like Descartes said, everything is mechanical, but there's not this island of paramechanical or immaterial substance on top of it. It's mechanism and machines all the way through, right? So this is an early version of the stuff that we'll be looking at next week in the computer model of the mind in some sense, yeah? And he's also saying, and so you need to study it empirically. And those are basically the options that you have coming out of Cartesian dualism. Give up interaction, or give up that minds are immaterial. And then you get this kind of very disenchanted picture of minds, humans just being complex machines and nothing else. Questions? No? So I'm just offering you ways to think about this stuff and kind of trying to show what issues this raises. Then we come to the last point. I was saying last week that the Cartesian picture comes along with self-knowledge, right? Consciousness is a way of knowing about yourself. And the thing that you get here is that in having any conscious experience whatsoever, you know that you're having it. You get a certain kind of self-knowledge. It's as if you were looking into your mind, again to use a spatial metaphor, to observe what is going on in there. And the special thing is going to be that only you can look inside your mind in that way. Nobody else can. Neuroscientists can't. Other people whom you interact with can't. Your knowledge of your own mind is special. You will never be able to convince me that I'm not feeling hunger when I think I am, that I'm not feeling pain when I think I am, that I'm not having a certain daydream when I'm convinced that I am. You can't do that. So what does that do to knowledge of other minds? And then we come to a first clear formulation of the other minds problem. So how do I know that you're not all zombies? How do I know that? You could just be complex robots, right? You could be very much like the Hubots that we looked at the beginning of Monday's lecture. Just complex machinery, but no experience going on. No lights are on, nobody's home. Do I know that in that picture? No, right? It could be. So this is a central problem. If you think that this very attractive position of saying you have immediate access to what is going on in your own minds, and that is a thing that we want to know, that gives me perfect authority of what is happening in me. But that also divorces me. If I accept that one, then I have no ability of really knowing what is going on in anybody else's mind, right? I can't look into anyone else's mind. And again, we see Descartes saying that just that, right? They could just be artificial machines wearing cloaks and hats and acting realistically. But I can't be really sure. How do I really know? I can't look into their minds. I can't do that. So there's a principal divide between the way I perceive other people and the way I perceive myself. And again, this is a persisting problem that you see up to this day. We'd been talking about Ryle. He denies that. The alternative is to say, we all have the same kind of external observational knowledge of other people, and that's all I have about my own mind as well. No special access. That's also a weird thing to say, yeah? So you have a choice here. Do you want special knowledge of your mind? If yes, then you have a problem about knowing about other minds. But Descartes also wants to say we have a way to know, at least when other systems don't have minds. That at least we can tell. There at least we can be sure. And he's telling us two things, basically. He's saying language use, that's something they can't do. They can't declare their thoughts to others. And remember that he's using thoughts in this very broad sense. Anything whatsoever. A robot can't really declare not just propositional thoughts, but also not feelings, not pains, not impressions, not hunger sensations. A robot can't declare any of that to us, and they might, at least they can't do it in a way that is appropriately meaningful. There's content missing from what they might be saying. So what might Descartes say if he's confronted with kind of intelligent parrots babbling on, or with this Hubots? Would he maybe say, empirically refuted, now you've presented empirical evidence, experimental evidence that some of these machines can produce linguistic responses to things. Would he have an answer to that? There's something there in the quotation that helps there. This is why I'm insisting on that point. Because this is a very strong argument. Yeah.
I think the challenge going on is they've learned a certain response and they can only give that certain response to a certain command.
So it's still just training, right? There's still some, maybe a behaviorist conditioning, right? They're still reacting to some signal in the environment, but there's no real understanding going on, right? Maybe it's a subtle cue, and it might look like real communication, but there's something missing. It's just reacting to something out there. It's basically like a sophisticated reflex reaction, right? You're just hitting the right nerve and then they're producing something. That's all it is. That's what he's going to have to say. It might be an illusion of understanding, but there's no real understanding going on. And we'll see this coming back next week with Searle, this point about real understanding and real meaning. And there's another point. That's why I highlighted the conceivable. It's not even conceivable. We can't even imagine. We can't coherently describe a picture. He thinks where a purely mechanical bulk of matter could be producing meaningful answers. That's not something that matter and machines can do. So he's saying this is not a matter of empirical investigation and empirical evidence. You can't conduct an experiment. It's not even conceivable. We can't even correctly, coherently describe this type of scenario. So this is a very strong, it's in principle impossible. And the corollary of that is going to be the other thing, what you said, general purpose intelligence. It's always going to be a specialized kind of intelligence. You're not going to be able to use it for everything. Yeah? So you might wonder about this, for animals, are they really, is that true? Is special versus general purpose intelligence something that sets us apart from animals? Is that really the case? And you can either come at this from the direction by saying animals can learn concepts, as we saw in the beginning. Maybe it is general purpose for animals, or you can deny that humans have this trick. You could come at this as well and say, well, maybe we're just complex responders to stuff. Maybe there's no general purpose intelligence here either. So I'm going to end here. There is one quotation that I'll put online that you can look at because some people thought otherwise at the time. Any last urgent questions? Cool. Then I'll see you next week.